Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be talking about Angular components. So, what are components and what do they have to do with Angular? Components are the most essential part of Angular, and that's not an over exaggeration. That is literally what it says in the documentation. The Angular framework is based on components. So, having a good understanding on components and how components work will absolutely help you become a better Angular developer and arguably a better developer of other frameworks, because a lot of the things that we learn within inside Angular we also use in other frameworks such as React and Vue.js. So the first thing is, what is a component? I am going to try to visualize what a component actually is, and the way I'm going to do that is I have a little bit of help. Here is a Nintendo Switch. You have the main game board here, and then you have the right trigger component. So this component allows me to use my right triggers, A tags, Y, B, and press all of those buttons. And then you have the left component, which allows me to access the D-pad to move around different characters when I'm playing my video games. So this is how I want you to think about components. Components are essentially like Lego pieces. So when I have a form, for example, on a website, that in itself can be a component, but also the button inside that form could be a component within inside that component. This is what we will call like a parent and a child component. This is going to be mostly a basic guide. I might touch on a few advanced topics, but I want to keep things very simple. So when we get into our first Angular component, the thing that I want to talk to you about is metadata. So when we have the at component, we have a bunch of things that we can use to configure our component. I'm not going to go through all of them. The main three that we're going to have for every component is the selector, the template URL, and the styles URL. So the selector is how we can access the component and put it inside different components or put it somewhere else in the HTML. The template URL is the actual URL file, the actual HTML file that we're going to reference the structure of the component. The CSS file, so the styles file, the styles URL is where our styles are actually going to be. So that is what an Angular component actually looks like. Typically, when we have a component in our folder structure, it will follow this kind of style. A component.ts file, a component.html file, a component.css file, and a component.spec file. And essentially, what all these files allow us to do is to create our component and how it's going to look. Now, we can also create all these files very simply with the Angular CLI, which is awesome. So, when we speak about Angular and components, and a very important topic that we have to touch on is the component lifecycle hooks. So, what are component lifecycle hooks? Essentially, in Angular, we can access the components at different times when it's performed different tasks. And upon accessing the component at that time, we can also execute certain code. So, the first example of this is ngOnInit. So ngOnInit is when the component first initializes. Upon initialization, we can then execute any code that we want. Normally, people would like to, for example, and you can try this, I welcome you to try this, put a console.log after when you put on an ngOnInit, and it will just say that the component is initialized. Next, we have the ngOnChanges. So essentially, ngOnChanges is triggered whenever any data bound property changes. So because in Angular we have two-way binding between your component.ts file and your component.html file, whenever this data changes, ngOnChanges will trigger, and then you can write any sort of code that you want and see what's been changed. Um, Finally, we have ngOnDestroyed, and upon upon destroying the component, so when the component is destroyed, we can write any code to, for example, unsubscribe. Um, and by unsubscribe, I mean we will stop subscribing to a observable, so we prevent any data leaks out there. There are several different ways we can communicate between components. So there are three main ways. We can talk to components. We can have a child component and a parent component talk to each other using at input and at output. We can do this. It's a very good way for a child and a parent component to communicate with each other. We can use services for components to communicate with each other, and we can also use libraries like Redux to allow us to communicate between different components. So that's been the bulk of my video about components. I just want to leave you with a bit more advice on how to use components. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is single responsibility. Try to make sure that your components are doing one thing. Now, there is no silver bullet rule. You are definitely going to run into a situation where your component is going to need to do more than one thing. Your component might be something that we categorize as a smart component, and it's actually doing multiple things. Um, and in that situation, your component might be able to do multiple things, but with the basics, or if you just want to keep things simple, you want to try to make sure that your component is doing one thing. If it's not, that's fine, but you want to keep it like that. We also want to organize our components into feature modules so we can do lazy loading. This is a bit more of an advanced tip. So essentially, we want to keep all of our components in certain feature modules or in a group of modules so we can lazy load them. And this is an amazing feature that Angular has that can speed up our application. We want to also use a different change detection strategy when it comes to the metadata. This is some advice I'm giving you, but do not take it as law. And nothing I say in this video you should take as law. But this can also backfire, and it could also cause your application to break in unpredictable way when we change the strategy. When we change the change detection strategy to on push. But it is a good way to speed up and improve the performance of your application. My personal advice is when you start a project, where you start a new piece of code, start with on push. And if it's not working the way you want it to work, then change it back to the normal change detection strategy, the default change detection strategy. But I would honestly just keep trying it. And the final bit of advice, very similar to the first, try to keep everything simple and simplify your HTML templates. Do not try to overcomplicate your HTML templates. You want to also leave a lot of logic inside the components. So that is my video on basic guide to Angular components. Thank you for taking the time to watch it. If you need any help or advice, feel free to send me a comment or message. I'm also on LinkedIn. Happy to get back to you guys. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a nice day.